this time is not something that we in the Jewish religion deal with on a regular basis. Remember that the last session we talked about the Exodus, and then we talked about Passover and so on. These are the foundations of our upbringing as children, as adults, our learning experience, the Torah, which the 5 books of Moses, which we read from beginning to end, starting in September and finishing in September, every year, is well known, most of it to us, and the prophets that we read every week, the section that we read is related directly to the Torah portion that we read every week. So there are a lot of sections of the prophets that we don't read. We know some of us know the stories, but we don't read it and we don't really learn it unless you get into learning classes like this within your community, within your synagogue, or usually within the synagogues. So this was new to me. I knew some of the stories, but probably out of context. The wisdom of Solomon, we knew of. David slaying Goliath, I knew the story, obviously. But completely out of the context that I've had to enjoy studying for the last couple of weeks. And there's a lot of varying discussions and so on, and which we'll hopefully talk about some of those as we go along. But we have to understand the context of what we're talking about. I know that we were to sort of start with David and Bathsheba. Well, that's great, except we kind of need to know how we got there. We go through a period, the period of Samuel, the period of Kings. It really starts a transition from the prophets, post-Moses, through Kings to the high priests. Ezra to the Messiahs, it was theocracy, and that's the rule over the kingdom using the law of God. So during the time of the high priests, Eli was at war with the Philistines. Oh, there's a lot of wars. By the way, if you're really squirmish about blood and guts, you don't want to be here today. There's a lot of it. I'll try and smooth over some of it. But during the time of the high priest, Eli was at war with the Philistines. And they killed Eli's sons. And that resulted in Eli dying as well out of sorrow. They captured the Ark of the Covenant, which obviously, as we know, I hope we know, was carried before the Israelites on their journey through the Sinai and into the Promised Land. But wherever the Ark goes, trouble invariably follows. And the Philistines captured the Ark, and they took it into their temple, and when they did, all their idols started collapsing and falling and breaking. So they took it out of the temple and they took it to remote towns. And everywhere they took it, people would get diseased, would die. Anybody think of a movie that maybe... Yeah, I had to mention that to somebody the other day. They'd never seen the movie. You lot at least probably have all seen the movie. But it really was, it really was the script for the Indiana Jones movie. After realizing how much devastation the Ark was causing them, Philistines gave it back to the Hebrews, and many of them died because they looked upon the Ark. And it was then hidden away for quite some time. And nobody obviously was allowed to look at it. Now later on we're going to hear about it being taken into to Jerusalem, and I'm still not quite sure how it was covered. We know that we're not allowed to look into it because supposedly that's where the tablets of the law are stored. But whether or not the film was very effective in portraying that, or whether or not, you know, this is the truth. I don't know where it is now. We do believe it's somewhere. Simon and I had the wonderful honor of going underneath the wall in Jerusalem, and it is supposedly under what is now the Temple Mount. But it's not in Israel's hands, it's in the Muslim hands. But supposedly it's buried underneath there somewhere. Anyway, getting back to this, so the ark has come back, it's hidden, it's put away. Samuel, who's the prophet, anoints Saul as the king of Israel, and because they wanted to be like their neighbors. Everybody else had a king. We don't have kings. So we just have prophets. So this Saul is the first king. And even though it's a theocracy, you know, God allows the appointment of the king. And it kind of rejects God as the notion of the supreme being. Saul disobeys Samuel's instructions in one of his wars with the Amalekites. And that leads Samuel to start looking for another king. And Samuel goes to this Anash, who has a number of sons, to see he's been guided by God, that this is where the next king will be. And David isn't there. David has a very strange introduction to the world, if you like. His mother was, and his father was one of his many wives, but not one that they particularly had much of a relationship and contact with. So, and I think he had 9 brothers. They didn't get along very well. He was out taking care of the sheep and everything else, and while the rest of the brothers kind of lived with the father in the household. Samuel comes to the house, David isn't there. He asks, there is somebody missing, I need this other child. David's finally brought in, and Samuel knows, because God has told him, that David is going to be the next king. David ingratiates himself to all, perhaps everybody except for King Saul, by killing Goliath in a battle with the Philistines. Goliath is this giant leader of the Philistine army, and as we all know the story, I'm sure, that David, with his slingshot, manages to score a bullseye and kills Goliath with 1 stone. Much to the delight of all of the Israelites, and obviously to the fear of the Philistines. This is going to play later on. He has become such a hero to the family. Saul has no choice but to bequeath his daughter, Michal, to David, and Michal becomes his wife. David also becomes Saul's son Jonathan's best friend. This will play out later on as David, with the help of Michal and with Saul, and with Jonathan, because Saul attempts to kill him on a couple of occasions. David manages to amass an army of supporters, and he flees. And peace comes to the area in the calmness, and David's rule, as time goes on, is kind of solidified by the fact that he has God looking over him, the priest looking after him, and in the end, we lose Saul, and David will take over. And that's really where the good part is. It's all downhill from this part on. With the guidance of Nathan the prophet, David is king through a peaceful era. But there is the wonderful portion that we read of David, what we call David's sin. Now, are we familiar with it? David is in his palace or whatever, and he's overlooking the buildings below, and he sees this beautiful woman come out and lounge in the sun. We're not quite sure, dressed or otherwise, but anyway, she is beautiful. Her name is Bathsheba, and David takes her and makes her pregnant. She is married, and her husband is, let's say, with the armed forces. He's with the fighting forces. There's a very interesting tractate to all of this. And this was done supposedly at the time of David in the Old Testament, but it was done as recently as in Eastern Europe. A lot of men who were sent off to war, or sent off to fight, or sent away from their homes to deal with, and it's particularly big in the Jewish communities, where they were either abducted or taken in slavery or whatever to deal with, certainly by the Tsar of Russia or whatever. One of the things that they would do before they went off to war is they would sign a get. A get is a Jewish document of agreeing to divorce, separation and divorce. So the rabbis say that in actual fact, Bathsheba was a divorced or separated woman, because her husband had gone off to fight, so he would have signed this document to her saying she is, because if he didn't come back, then she is now free to get married again. And a get is the Jewish divorce agreement that allows the two parties to go off and marry again without bigamy. So the learned people will say that Bathsheba was actually not married. Now, the fact that it then goes through this whole cycle, or David sends his Bathsheba's husband off to fight another battle where he's killed, that's what he would have done. He was a soldier. He was with the armed forces. He would go off. Whether he was left in an untenable situation, obviously we'll never know. But that's their way around maybe lessening the sin, if you like, of what David did. The fact that he would take another woman was normal. I mean, you had multiple wives in those days. Who could afford them? But anyway, you would have multiple wives, and you would have children by multiple wives, as indeed David did. David was a child of one wife, whereas his brothers were children of other wives to his father. But this sin was, I mean, I guess the ultimate punishment, if you like, was that the child died. The baby that Bathsheba bore to him as a result of that relationship died. as God's punishment for what they had done. Subsequently, of course, he had other children. Of course, we all know about Solomon, and we'll come to that soon. But David was approached by Nathan, the prophet, who gave him a parable about a wealthy man who takes a poor man's sheep to give it to somebody who was hungry, rather than his own, where he had many sheep and many animals. The poor person only had one. And the rich man took that one sheep and gave it to somebody. And David was furious and just livid by this outcome. And what Nathan said, no, I'm not talking about him, I'm talking about you, what you have done. And a lot of the commentaries from that point on shows David in a lot of understanding of what his sin was. He obviously was full of remorse, and he repents, and he begs God for forgiveness, he begs Nathan for forgiveness, and it ushers in another period of peace until his son Solomon finally takes over. He passed on the throne to Solomon, even though Solomon actually wasn't supposed to have the throne. Solomon, because he was born to Bathsheba, and it was a later child to Bathsheba, David had a child by his first wife, and he was supposed to actually take, and you can probably get, there's going to be a few issues down the road as things go on. We now, coming into Kings, we start looking at the period of time that Solomon is now king. And Solomon is always regarded as being very wise, very thoughtful. Where did that come from? He asked God, not for riches, not for wealth, not for prominence, not for doing. He asked God for one thing: wisdom. That's all he asked. God granted him many of the other things, but he asked for wisdom. Do we know the story of the two women? Yes? Okay, I won't go into that. But it shows that that's what is being used, or what is used in the stories as the example of Solomon's wisdom. I just want to come back to something. Anybody here know the link between Adam and David? Anybody know? Anybody heard of that? Know the link? When God appeared to Adam, he told him that there was going to be somebody great that will happen in the future, and that that he would have a very short life, because Adam, there's 1,000 years that he has to use. Now, there's several commentaries, but this is the one I happen to like. You have 1,000 years. And so Adam gave up 70 years of his life so that David could live. And David came to the throne when he was 35 years of age, and he was on the throne for 40 years. So he had his 40 years. As another aside, my Hebrew name is Adam David. So my parents, whether they knew it or not, I'm not so sure they did actually. My parents gave me a full life, please God. Touch wood. What do we do? But so Adam gave his 70 years for David to live, and David obviously used his life very, very well. Solomon, besides living wisely, he built the temple to God, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought to the temple, and really this confirms, in their view, it confirmed their obedience to God. It's referenced several times in these readings about Solomon that he was as good as his father. So obviously, as time had gone on, and this is the conversation between the prophets and Solomon and God and so on, that God had accepted David's repentance for what he had done to a huge extent, because he's now got his son and he's giving stability to the land and to the people. I read this and I read it again. There was a sacrifice. There was a sacrifice for 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep, which kind of leaves you wondering about the abundance. I don't know whether that leaves room for many people, but anyway, this is in Kings 8. I don't get it, but huge sacrifices. People wonder why we don't necessarily live by the law anymore. Yeah, I'd say that's one of the reasons. God warns Solomon regarding the consequences of turning away from God's laws, and he's obviously, as I said, forgiven David at this point and forgiven him for what he had done, and as a result of his repentance, which may sound very familiar to people with an evangelical background, and I know this very well because I worked for many years with Dr. Billy Graham and his team. The idea of repentance is huge. It is your way back. It is your way back to God. It is your way back to that solid basis of your life that we all want. Jew, Christian, and we all, that's what our belief is, and that's what it all comes back down to. As we move on, after Asa's 38-year reign, Ahab is the king. There were sections you left out, which I'm assuming they were left out for a reason. So
yeah,
this is all.
Like I didn't.
Or right, what you gave me.
Yeah.
And Ahab marries Jezebel, who's the daughter of the king of the Sidonians, and they are worshippers of Baal, another god. And Elijah the prophet, there's a prophet now, he warns Ahab of the sins, and has warned, as we have read so many times, particularly in Solomon, that God's instructions leave no area for discussion. This is the way your life is to be run. This is what you need to do. And Elijah leaves for areas east of the Jordan as a famine starts to ravage Israel. Famine is God's control of your life, ultimately. In those kind of situations, you've got the wars ongoing with the various other nations around you, but ultimately it comes down to one famine. 3 years of drought follow due to everybody turning away from God, turning to Baal, turning to worship idols. And Elijah is commanded by God to return to Ahab Jezebel has put to death all the prophets, except for the ones that had escaped and been hidden by Obadiah. He saved them all by hiding them in caves. And Obadiah was the man, he was in charge of the palace and was a God-fearing man. Consequently, when Elijah presented himself to him, he was immediately recognized for who he was. And there's the wonderful story of Elijah pitting God against the 400 priests of Baal. I'm sorry, forgive me for reading because this was all new to me until 2 weeks ago, thank you. So I'm really, it's understanding what actually happened, but if I tell you something you know, forgive me for that, but I found the story fascinating, particularly one line of it. Elijah takes takes two sacrificial lambs, animals of some nature, and says to the Baal worshippers, sacrifice the lamb. You sacrifice by causing fire, right, and burning and so on. That's how things are sacrificed. Have your God, there it is, sacrifice. Nothing happens. Bring your thunder, your lightning, your flames of it, nothing happens. Elijah then soaks his area, where his sacrifice is, with water. Now my comment was, where the heck did the water come from after 3 years of famine? Famine and drought, I mean, they go hand in hand. Where do you get all this water? Anyway, never mind, that's just me. Needless to say, on command, on his pleading with God, the fire comes down and Elijah's sacrifice is made. The people then seize all the prophets of Baal and slaughter them. Yeah, told you it gets gory. But that was how they dealt with it. And at that point, some semblance, I guess, of normalcy is restored, but it doesn't last long. And people start off in their ways, they're worshipping other things, everything, God becomes secondary to their lives, and we then come into the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And they invade, they lay siege to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, by the way, was the city David built. It's sometimes known as the city of David. And the temple was built by Solomon. So between the two of them, they basically established God's word and the Ark of the Covenant and so on in this one place. The Babylonians lay siege, wipe out huge numbers of the Israelites, capture the city of Jerusalem, burn it to the ground, and we mourn on a couple of occasions in our Jewish year the destruction of the temple, the first and second destructions of the temples. Hugely significant in our liturgies. I've talked for a long time, so let me open up. If there's something I've missed or you have a question, please.
Well, I'm kind of interested, like, the way that the 5 stories are grouped together, just like in this study, they're all grouped under the title, The Fall of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I like how it's like 5 stories, but they kind of cheat on that and like slip a whole bunch of stories into each chunk. But yeah, the 5 passages or whatever, the fall of Israel, like it does make it seem as if, the sins of David, the tolerance that Solomon has for idol worship, then passing of the kingdom to people who aren't as faithful to God, that all of that is what, like, results in the exile.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that at all a Jewish?
No, not really.
Okay.
No. I mean, I guess we look for the good bits. So we really focus on what was, I guess, eventually to come of it all. And even this whole decline, you know, in these 5 passages, it's a bit of a roller coaster. It gets really good for a while. You know, as I say, the whole David sin is an interesting interpretation, whether you look at which commentary you look at, whether it was such a terrible sin, or whether it was basically a normal way of life under the conditions that they were living in.
Well, and like the problem wasn't, like, it certainly wasn't Bathsheba's sin.
No.
The problem wasn't that he had more, like, relations with women. The problem was having her husband killed off, right? Like, that was
Yes,
sin.
or putting him in the position that he was to be killed, or he could be killed. I'm sorry, yes.
This is a big thing with me because it was connected in a way with my dissertations, and I've been thinking about it a lot because I haven't had it published. But anyway, the point is the first date that I learned in seminary, the most important date, and everything else worked around it, was 586 when the Babylonians came in and took, you know, they took the Jewish people away to Babylon, to exile. And I think when I went to seminary, I didn't know the difference between the Exodus and the exile. So that was
Bit of a
really
difference,
important in the very, but the point is that, to me, that this is my point, not the point, but that is a historical event. That really happened. I mean, a lot of it really happened, but that really for sure happened. And they didn't take everybody, but they took all the important people away.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they were weeping by the rivers of Babylon. And that changed everything. And then eventually they got to come back, which is the real miracle. But they did not want to blame God for what was happening to them. So it was just natural for them to blame themselves. We have sinned, or this wouldn't have happened. Because our God is the true God. And our God is all-powerful. And our God did this to us to punish us for what we did. They're blaming themselves, and so they go back to the stories and say, yeah, well, look at that. David did that thing that was bad. You know, all these things that were bad really were bad, but it's a way of trying to make sure that God isn't to blame for what happened. But God only did this because God had to do this because of our sin.
But God certainly in these passages has forgiven David.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
right. So if he's forgiven him, are you saying that he's come back later and say, you know what, that forgiveness was wrong?
No, you're forgiven.
But
they needed a reason why this terrible, terrible disaster happened to them.
I'll bring it to modern day Holocaust.
Yeah.
How do so many God-fearing people
Deal with that. Yeah.
deal with that?
Exactly.
And I'm not sure, I certainly don't have the answer because none of us do. But it's also formed in my life a question about isolation, about fear of the unknown, about unwillingness to learn and understand other people, other religions and so on. I like to think that my darling wife has helped me because I was brought up in a Jewish home, not Orthodox Jewish. It was a Jewish home. I mean, I had the tar beaten out of me for bringing home bacon-flavored crisps once. Even though there's absolutely no bacon in them, my parents decided that, or my mother actually, decided that this was like one of the worst things I could do. However, every year we would go on holiday, and our idea of holiday was going anywhere we could have bacon and eggs for breakfast. But inside the home, absolutely not. Absolutely nothing would not be kosher, and so it's understanding that mentality, but also understanding the fact that my parents fortunately were not Holocaust survivors. They were already living in England. They were in England second generation, but going through what they knew of, obviously. It's a question that bothers. How could God allow that to happen? How could God not hear the cries of His people? Sorry, just.
Oh, I'm sorry. So where we are in the story, though, is after Solomon, the sons fought over the kingdom.
Yes.
And the kingdom's been split in two.
Yes.
Before Babylon.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So,
There were two exiles.
Yeah.
The northern kingdom,
Yeah.
and then 100 years later was Babylon.
Yes.
So I mean, we really have collapsed a lot of time in these portions.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, so I'd be interested how you think. So things were okay under Solomon, but God gave us free will as humans, and we tend to make bad choices. Is what my observation is, in that I know when I was studying for last week, and I knew all this, but I just brought it back again, especially with what's going on in the world today, that God did not think kings were a good idea.
No.
And I think people say, well, you're studying all this stuff, what bearing does it have what's going on today? And I said, well, I read this, and then really? it's we can learn, and we can say, this wasn't what God intended, and what did God intend, and was for us to be faithful.
Right. But I think the whole idea of the Israelites being a group of people led by prophets and not kings was what God saw as differentiating them from the other neighbors. They'd just gone through, we all know the stories through, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's so many battles with so many different kingdoms that what defined the Jewish people, or the Israelites, was the fact that they were not they didn't bow down to why. That's the reason that Moses didn't, and none of them who left Egypt, none of them got to go into the promised land because of the golden calf, which was them worshipping an idol. I had an interesting story. I didn't know this. I know we're going back a couple of weeks. And I don't know where this came from. Only 20% of the Israelites left Egypt. Did you know that? Did you ever heard that? Anybody?
I knew it wasn't all of them, but I didn't think it was that small.
So I was told that, and I didn't realize it was that small because there's 600,000. That means 20% would be 3 million of them.
Yeah.
And in the area that they were living, I don't know how you could have gotten. And it was only 3.5 million Egyptians at that time, maximum. I don't know. I just threw it out.
We can't take any of the numbers.
I can't.
Seriously,
I don't understand. But where this 20% came
Tell
from.
the story, you change the.
Well,
Yeah.
We do that all the
Egyptians
time.
were being outnumbered by the Jewish people. That would certainly make them upset.
Yeah, it would be very close.
You need to control that population inside your domain.
Yes.
That is different. So how do you keep them happy? And if a bunch of them want to leave, maybe that's not a bad idea.
No. Well, and after what they did, and all the plagues and so on. Anyway, I hadn't heard that before, and when I started reading this, wait a minute, 20%, that's 600,000, that would have been 3 million. Yeah, something's...
I think we also, I think your other presentation had some Egyptians were in that.
Yes, yes. And that was something else I brought up to this learned gentleman. And he seemed to be a little dumbfounded that I either knew or that there were a number of Egyptians that left with them. But even in his own writings, I found a mention of a number of Egyptians that did leave with them. So...
An entirely different question. How does Elijah fit into the Jewish religion? He seemed, I mean, we read Isaiah about every 3 out of 4 weeks, but Elijah was the chap that in the Christian faith, the Transfiguration, where a couple of the disciples went up to the mountains and they thought they saw God, and it wasn't Isaiah, or it was Elijah.
Yeah.
And Moses.
Yeah, and Moses. Moses we hear a lot of, but
Right, Elijah is the prophet never died. He went to heaven. He is our Messiah. At the Passover Seder service, there is a cup of wine set in the middle of the Seder plate, and at a strategic point of the service, usually after dinner, because you know the law, right? They attacked us, we won, let's eat. So after the eating part, a prayer is said. It is customary for the lady of the house to go and open the front door. And the blessing is said, welcoming Elijah into the house, where he will take a drink of wine. And for the children's benefit, sitting around the table, the father will usually hit the table like that, so you'll see the wine suddenly move, and Elijah was here. So, but it is part of our story, and it's part of the fact that, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Christian religion, Jesus is the Messiah. In the Jewish religion, the Messiah has yet to come. And the Messiah will be Elijah. So when he comes back on a winged chariot.
Well, there is some suggestion in the New Testament that John the Baptist was like the return of Elijah, right? Like that is a suggestion that gets floated around about John.
They also asked Jesus, are you Elijah?
Yeah.
Or some people say it's you Elijah.
Yeah, I've heard that. Billy. Yeah, the last Billy Graham crusade I did was in New York. That was Billy's last crusade. And we were hoping he was going to do one after that in London, but unfortunately health overtook. But the last one, and there was a lot of discussion. They even had a gentleman on preaching that mentioned exactly this, that Elijah and Jesus, and I think they used, what is Jesus' Hebrew name? Yeah, it's used in certainly in the Torah discussions from the Christian standpoint, the Old Testament from the Christian standpoint, it is referenced. But yes, for us, he's yet to come. And anytime soon would be really appreciated at this point. Could you pop into America first?
He came with Mormons. He came to the Mormons to America.
Oh, okay, that's what it was. That's what it was. But yeah, it really was, as I say, it wasn't just a downhill slide from the time of David. There were ups and downs, there was reconciliations, there was agreements. David at one point actually, after Saul threw him out, he actually teamed up with the Philistines and came back to defeat Saul with the aid of the Philistines. It obviously didn't go well in the long run, and also I like to try and look at trying to look at the geographical side of things. So could it be the Philistines were the original Palestinians? Is that the area of the Middle East that was inhabited by them? There was a whole discussion, we talked about it at the last session, about the fact that Israel went around them and around where the Egyptian army and the Philistines and everything would have been in order to get to the promised land, which would have taken them, as we discussed, through Saudi Arabia and not through Sinai. So there's so many enclaves all the way around the different nations, all with their way of worshipping. I'm always curious as to where they all came from. You know, it's how did these different sects, you know, we learn about the 12 tribes, but obviously it's much wider, and praying to everything in that was meaningful in their existence. And the Israelites had only one thing to pray to. Who brought them food, manna in the wilderness, who brought them to water when they needed it, who defeated every army and anybody uprising against them. There was one focus, and that's, as we said before, when they started asking for kings, God sees it as a rejection, but subsequently sees his way back into their lives through the priest and through the kings. And certainly in the case of someone like Solomon, you've got a good foundation for God's word to the population. There are a lot of other kids there. There was it David? David had 5 sons. I think Solomon was the youngest, and a daughter, and one of the sons raped the daughter, the other son raped the son that raped the daughter, killed the son that raped the daughter. I mean, it was a pretty unsteady society at the time, which is probably why we don't study it as a regular course. It's like, okay, you don't want to know about those things. It's not quite right. It
doesn't get left out of our set of readings.
And evidently, yeah, you guys are much more.
I had great comics, like, Old Testament comic book things in Sunday school that had Jezebel being thrown down from the street. And
Jezebel.
Elijah, seeing the cloud and the rain coming and burning the offerings, all that stuff that you were talking about.
Right.
Had that in
That's in there.
Oh, really?
David's family transgressions are not in our liturgy, just like Judges was not.
Well, it used to be.
Lectionary, sorry,
It's
not
in the
the
lectionary.
lectionary,
It
not
used
the
to be the
lectionary. Pardon?
If I go to an old BCP and go through the lectionary, I'm pretty sure that I heard all that stuff in normal Old Testament readings all my life.
King James Version, BC,
Yeah.
prayer, but the revised common lectionary.
Okay, so we dropped them. See, I wasn't aware we dropped them.
Yeah, there are a lot of them.
I mean, we get some juicy bits, like, I'm pretty sure, like, Bathsheba comes up
Oh,
for
sure.
sure.
Yeah,
but
Bathsheba's.
I don't think we have, like, the kids killing and raping each other.
No.
Right.
But David mourning over Absalom.
That's in there.
That's,
Okay,
yeah,
that's,
that's-
yeah, all right.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
I was just really struck by what you said, like, partway through your overview of the 5 readings about repentance. Like, that is the foundation of the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is that there is a way back to God.
Yes.
And that God is like trying to find a way back to us too. You kind of like said that just a moment ago about the kings. And, you know, like it wasn't God's will, but then God saw a way of like coming back to us and inviting us back to God. And like in that vein, I see the David story and David and Bathsheba as like so important in that respect. I mean, poor Bathsheba and her husband, like, you know, they were the victims and all of that. But to have the courage to portray your like exalted leader of faith as a sinful man who did a bad thing and then was able to hear that call of repentance and come back. Like that's it, right? Like that is like
Yeah,
you said it, right?
That's exactly-
that is like
yeah.
the story.
yes.
There's a lot of that in the Bible, that the person who's our hero killed somebody or did something. You know, Paul was persecuting the Christians, and who was it? Moses killed an Egyptian.
Yeah.
You know,
Just why-
and you think a murderer, you know, but that's the way God works. That things can be forgiven.
I think, I mean, one of the pieces that I noticed and I found quite interesting is David was the sixth. So David was the spiritual heir of the prophet Samuel, in the chain of tradition beginning with Moses at Mount Sinai. So of the six, David was the sixth. He followed Moses, Joshua, Phinehas, Eli, Samuel, and then David. And David was to his people not merely a king of unsurpassed valor, but the spiritual leader as well. He surrounded himself with the greatest and the wisest spiritual leaders of his time, some of which names I am not going to try. And ultimately the prophet Nathan and the seer Gad. They formed the highest court of Israel, the Sanhedrin, under the presidency of King David. And the Sanhedrin is still regarded as the ultimate judicial court in our lives. David's life was a sacred one, consecrated to God and to his people. It was not so much by his valor and his courage that he won the hearts of his people, as by the saintliness of his character, so touchingly expressed in the book of Psalms. This is perhaps the most popular of the books of the Bible. The simple, poetic genius of pathos, sweetness, and heartfelt piety, the book of Psalms, is unique. And the Psalms of David comprise every phase of his life. In the history of David, his exile, persecution, struggles, and eventual triumph of the Jewish people. Collectively and individually, they find a painful prototype of their own life, a faithful prototype of their own life. No wonder the book of Psalms, throughout the ages, has served as a boundless source of inspiration, courage, and hope. And the Psalms of David are part of our liturgy. And actually, they're more part of our daily prayer book than they are of the Torah, obviously the Torah readings and the books of... So anyway, so David passed away on the Sabbath, which coincided with the festival of Shavuot, in the year 2924, 837 years before the Common Era. His reign lasted for 40 years, as we discussed. In the first 7 years, he reigned in Hebron over the tribe of Judah, and the remaining 33 years, he resigned in Jerusalem over all Israel. For 6 months, however, he was in exile during the revolt of Absalom, one of his sons. So it wasn't the beginning, it was the beginning of the period, ultimately, of the decline, But there was so much else that happened, and the kings later on certainly brought it on themselves, as did the people, But your question is, how does God let this happen? It's free, it is our will, but how does He let bad things happen to good people is always the question that will go with us to our deathbeds, because you just have to shake your head and you wonder. And it really is. It's a terrible, it's a view of our world, I guess. I can't believe I had so many relatives who were bad people. They're all gone. My great-grandparents had 13 children, and 5 survived. Actually, 4 survived. One of them was captured trying to get to England, and he was captured in France and taken to Auschwitz. His wife, he pushed his daughter out, or the wife pushed the daughter out the bathroom window when the Nazis came in the house in Paris. And the sad thing is that the daughter would have nothing to do with the rest of the family because she blamed us for not saving her parents. And she subsequently married and had children, and our family was forever divided because of her perception that his brothers, my uncle's brothers, had done nothing to get him out, which was not true, but it's the perception, obviously, when you see death. And Simon and I were in Auschwitz, and we found their names in the book in Auschwitz. But it comes back to it, how did I can't believe they were bad people. That's what I don't want to believe. And then there was 7 other brothers and sisters. No, brothers. The one sister did get out. So, but yeah, how does that happen? How does what happened here and repeatedly, how does that happen? Are there no good people? So I don't know the answers. It's way out of my depth, but it's obviously questions that we all have. Would we be less inclined towards hatred if we understood more about each other? That's my go-to. It's a tough question. It's a tough question because you do fear what you don't understand, and you do fear what you don't know. And whether we're talking about Judeo-Christian relationships or Judeo-Muslim or anything like this, you talk about relationships between people, and ultimately it does come down to religion, and ultimately it comes down to a lack of understanding of religion. And on that note, I hope that I have been able to impart from not a learned, but personal point of view. Thank you.
One of the people in that story that I admire was David. And he was a high priest.
Yes.
And I guess that's the same position that Eli and Samuel are.
Yes.